Hi, I'm Sarah Lopez with Preservation Inc. and this presentation is intended to be an update on the development of the 35% Alternative Compliance Pathway, or ACP Work Plan. It's also intended to be a little bit of a catch-up for folks who may be tuning into the process late in the game or partway through the process, so that we can all be conceptually on the same page. So the presentation has 5 components. I'm going to review the 35% ACP Work Plan requirements, a conceptual framework just for groundwater areas and the movement of nitrogen in and out and between those areas. Also some concepts from Ag Order 4.0 and how those fit within this groundwater framework. Then I'm going to talk about the alternative compliance pathway and how some new concepts that we might introduce with the ACP can be applied to that framework. And then I'm going to provide a summary of remaining tasks and decisions that lay before Preservation Inc. and our stakeholder advisory process as we move from this point in time, basically the very beginning of March, through our April 15th submittal deadline. I'm also going to break this presentation up into 2 separate videos. So if you are playing catch up, or you're someone who needs to monitor sort of the entirety of the thought process very closely, you'll want to go ahead and watch video 1, where I list out the work plan requirements and the conceptual framework and how the 4.0 concepts as they exist now in the order apply to that framework. If, however, you're already an expert on the A-R equation, you're already familiar with what's required for the 35% work plan, or you don't care that much in great detail, feel free to just skip forward to video number 2, which really gets to the meat of what are we thinking about proposing in this work plan. So moving forward with video number 1 here in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to review the 35% work plan requirements. We are required by Ag Order 4.0 to propose groundwater protection areas and the supporting scientific justification for those areas. We're required to propose groundwater protection formulas, objectives, and the supporting scientific justification for those formulas. We are required to provide a groundwater protection value methodology, so a method for deriving groundwater protection values, and the objectives of that methodology. We don't have to define the actual values, however, those will be proposed in the 70% work plan. So this is an iterative work plan process. There's a 35%, then way down the road in a future year there's a 70% work plan, and then future year or years after that there's a 100% work plan. Finally, this 35% work plan needs to propose a groundwater protection target methodology and objectives. And again, the actual targets will be proposed in the 70% work plan. Finally, there needs to be an assessment and evaluation program outline and a methodology and objectives for that assessment and evaluation program. A few other considerations with the 35% work plan and the ACP in general. So the ACP does need to include follow-up actions and consequences for targets not achieved, and those will be proposed in the 70% work plan. So they're not required for the 35% work plan. Another point is that ACF, that's the annual compliance form that growers are required to submit annually under Ag Order 4.0. Total nitrogen applied reporting and irrigation and nutrient management plan summary reporting, or INMP reports, those are all requirements of Ag Order 4.0. They are required at the individual ranch level. They're required to be public, location specific, operation specific, and participation in the ACP will not cancel those requirements. Final note is that ranch level groundwater discharge monitoring, so kind of like individual monitoring programs for groundwater, will not be required of third-party members participating in the ACP. So this is where we're kind of launching a cooperative program here. So those are the 35% work plan requirements. Now I want to talk about a conceptual framework, again, for the various areas of a groundwater basin and how nitrogen moves in and out of and between those areas. And I'm just going to refer to this as the framework. So you could think of the groundwater basin as kind of as a layer cake with some icing on top. So the icing is the land surface. Then the top layer is the root zone, the middle layer is the vadose zone, also sometimes referred to as the subroot zone, and that can vary in thickness. And then we have an aquifer or water-bearing zone, and that's also the receiving water body that the ag order is intended to protect. And you can think of nitrogen moving in and out of these areas as nitrogen inputs to one of these zones. I should use the word zone, not area. So nitrogen inputs to one of these zones are shown in dark green. Nitrogen losses or removals from these various zones are shown by light green arrows. And that's really it. There's inputs, there's losses. The net of those inputs and losses to the root zone, it leaves the root zone as a loss and enters the vadose zone as an input. There's lateral transfer of nitrogen in and out of the vadose zone from sort of adjacent vadose zone areas. The net of all that vadose zone activity constitutes a loss, so nitrogen transport to the aquifer, where it's shown here as an input to the aquifer. And then finally, there's the lateral transfer of nitrogen in and out of an aquifer. And just a little more complexity here. This is kind of the full picture. I just broke that nitrogen input arrow into several various input types. The loss arrow, several nitrogen loss pathways from the root zone, and then I'm also representing some cycles here because there are some ways that nitrogen cycles within the root zone, and then depending on the time period you're interested in, those cycles can result in either a net release of nitrogen that acts as an input into the root zone, or a net uptake or immobilization of nitrogen that effectively removes that nitrogen from being actively available to movement within the root zone. Okay, so that's the framework. And now I want to talk about the concepts in Ag Order 4.0 as it currently stands and how those apply to the framework. So in Ag Order 4.0, we have groundwater protection areas, formulas, values, and targets. The area is the land surface unit over which nitrogen application and removal data are summed or integrated. And in Ag Order 4.0 as adopted, the groundwater protection area is currently one ranch. In Region 5, the Central Valley, the groundwater protection area is currently one township. The formula is the equation or model used to determine the amount of nitrogen discharged to groundwater from an area. In Ag Order 4.0, the groundwater protection formula can be simplified to A minus R. In Region 5, the groundwater protection formula is actually a process model. It's the Soil and Water Assessment Tool, or SWAT model. The value is the formula output, or the net pounds of N determined by the formula to be discharged to groundwater from a groundwater protection area over time. In Ag Order 4.0, the groundwater protection values are calculated with grower-reported data for nitrogen applied and nitrogen removed terms. Again, with that A minus R equation. And the target is the value, whatever value, generally one number for a given area, that is determined to be protective of the drinking water beneficial use. So maintaining the aquifer under 10 parts per million as N, with some additional provisions for non-degradation of even cleaner areas. And in Ag Order 4.0, the final groundwater protection target is 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. And in Region 3 only, this target is also a regulatory limit for which failure to meet the limit constitutes non-compliance with the order. So a limit is like a target in concept with more consequences for failing to meet it. So here's how these terms, these vocabulary words from the previous slide, fit into the conceptual framework of a groundwater basin. So the area is the land surface unit over which the nitrogen application and removal data are summed or integrated. The formula is the equation or model used to determine the amount of nitrogen discharged to groundwater from an area. So primarily we're dealing with root zone there. The value is the net pounds or mass of nitrogen determined by the formula to be discharged to groundwater from a groundwater protection area over time. So generally speaking, we're talking about what mass of nitrogen leaves the root zone. And then the target is the value that is deemed protective of the drinking water beneficial use. So to maintain the aquifer under 10 parts per million as N. Now in Ag Order 4.0, every ranch is its own groundwater protection area, regardless of its size, regardless of adjacent crops, regardless of adjacent land uses, the presence of rivers, etc., etc. So conceptually, it looks like this. Ranch number 1 here is a unique groundwater protection area for the root zone, vadose zone, and aquifer sort of immediately beneath it. Ranch number 2 is its own unique groundwater protection area, and ranch number 3 also would be its own unique groundwater protection area. Now here's how we do formulas and targets in Ag Order 4.0 as it currently stands without the alternative compliance pathway. So in Ag Order 4.0 we have an applied minus removed, or A minus R, equation with 3 variants acting as the formula by which nitrogen discharge from the root zone is calculated. And a slightly different formula or equation is used to then incorporate some vadose zone processes, basically denitrification and recharge, to derive that target or the final limit of 50 pounds of N per acre per year. The term formula is actually not defined in the Ag Order document or attachments. I think generally we apply to the formula when we're talking about calculating values, but there's also this idea of a formula or some calculation method being used to set a target. And just to point out that if we're talking about a formula used to calculate values, that's different than a formula or equation or calculation or process that would be used to set a target. So we need to be clear whether we're talking about setting values or setting targets when we discuss these things. Okay. Now these are the 3 A minus R equations in Ag Order 4.0 with their relevant targets and limits. And I'm going to talk mostly about the first one because it's the primary equation. So in this equation, it relates to a final limit of 50, which needs to be achieved by the end of 2051, with a step-down schedule of interim targets and limits beginning with 500 by the end of 2023, so the end of this year. The first term, A fer, that's the nitrogen applied as fertilizer in pounds per acre. A ear, so jumping over a few terms, over to here, that is the N applied in irrigation water based on the volume of water required for crop ET, or to meet crop ET. ET means evapotranspiration. A comp, that's the amount of nitrogen applied by a grower in compost, and C is a compost discount factor reflecting the delayed mineralization of N, so effectively it kind of reduces that A comp term. A org is the N applied in organic fertilizers, and similarly it has an organic fertilizer discount factor reflecting delayed availability of that nitrogen in the root zone. And R is the amount of nitrogen removed through harvest or other loss pathways. Also important to point out here that R in all the formulas is actually the sum of 5 possible removal terms. So R harv typically the biggest removal term, is the N removed from the field through the harvest or other removal of crop materials, and that's also expressed in pounds per acre and reported by growers. R-seq, is a sequestration removal of nitrogen that's sequestered in woody plant materials of permanent or semi-permanent crops. So think about a tree trunk of an orchard crop, for example. R-scavenge is the nitrogen credited as being removed from the field through nitrogen scavenging cover crops, high carbon amendments, or high carbon mulches. And then, so generally speaking, we think of this as the cover crop credit. R-treat is the amount of N that may be removed through a quantifiable treatment method. For example, if a grower has invested in a denitrifying bioreactor of some sort on their ranch. And R-other leaves open the possibility that other methods of nitrogen removal from the root zone may be approved by the Water Board in the future, and that these methods have not been quantified at this time, but it leaves open the possibility for the future. So now let's place those A-R formulas into our conceptual framework of the groundwater area. This visualization depicts the first of the three A-R equations, so the one we are most familiar with. And I'm also going to use it to depict the derivation of the final limit of 50 pounds of N per acre per year. So here's all the input terms, all the A's from the A-R equation. There's A fer, nitrogen fertilizer, A comp, nitrogen in compost, times the discount factor, which reduces the amount a little bit. A org, the nitrogen in organic fertilizer, multiplied by its discount factor, which reduces it a little bit, and the nitrogen in irrigation water. And then here's all those 5 R terms, or the loss pathways, so harvest, sequestration in woody plant parts, scavenge, that's the cover crop credit, R-treat, for example, a bioreactor, and R-other, so removal methods not yet quantified. And the net of all those inputs minus all those outputs amounts to some generally positive net movement of nitrogen out of the root zone down into the vadose zone. Now, why does the ag order seek to limit this amount to 50 pounds of N per acre per year? Well, this is because, this is just a fact, if you add 27 pounds of nitrogen to 1 acre foot of water, it will raise the concentration of that water by 10 milligrams per liter, 10 parts per million as N. And the Water Board makes an allowance and cites some literature in Ag Order 4.0 to basically support the idea that an additional 4-ish pounds of nitrogen per acre per year could be lost to denitrification. So 27 plus 4 equals 31. So now we're at 31, still not quite to 50. Now we factor in the idea that some clean recharge, so water that's not from farms, but maybe it's from a nearby river, maybe it's from a land use that doesn't result in any discharge of nitrogen, that clean recharge may be occurring at about 1.66 acre-feet per acre per year on the Central Coast, just with a very broad brush generally. So we get this dilution factor of 1.66. So we take our 31 pounds of N per acre per year, multiply that by 1.66, and we come up with 50. And that's where the 50 comes from. So thinking about it backwards, I'm not sure if my little speaker box is in the way here. 50 pounds of N per acre, you dilute that to about 31 pounds of N per acre with recharge, reduce that to about 27 pounds of N per acre per year with denitrification, and that leaves you with leachate that really should be no more than 10 parts per million as N. So this mass of nitrogen in an acre foot of water would amount to leachate that does not exceed 10 parts per million as N. Okay, note on groundwater protection values in the ag order. So Nitrogen applied and removed data, that's the A and the R for the A-R equation, are reported by growers at the ranch level annually. Those reports are public and they are location and operator specific. That is the case in Ag Order 4.0 as it currently stands, and there is no proposal on the table to change that for the alternative compliance program. Now the values calculated via the A-R equation, or one of its variants, using that grower-reported A-R data, determine compliance with the step-down targets or the final limit. And again, these targets are simply a step-down timeline from 500 pounds by the end of this year to that final limit of 50 by 2051. Okay, so that takes us through the 35% ACP Work Plan requirements, this general conceptual framework for groundwater zones and how nitrogen moves between those zones and in and out of them, and how the concepts in Ag Order 4.0 can be visualized or applied to this framework. So I'm going to end this video update here, and if you're interested in the alternative compliance pathway concepts and how they apply to that framework, and also a discussion of what remains for us to do between now and our April 15th deadline, you can watch video number 2. So thanks for tuning in.